an unsurprising thing from what we know about his life, patience, and what is a surprising thing when you think about war and peace, humility. Today with us, we have as our moderator, Colleen Nelson, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the editorials that she wrote at the Dallas Morning News. She covered the 2016 election for the Wall Street Journal following Hillary Clinton, and traveled with President Obama to South Africa to visit with the Mandela family during his last illness and visit Robben Island with them. I hope she says more about that today. She's brought a new community-oriented focus to the editorial page of the Star. Sahm Venter, who has edited the prison letters, is a longtime South African journalist and the senior researcher for the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and also the co-author of Winnie Mandela's autobiographical 491 Days about her own prison experience. And last, and certainly not least, Zamaswazi Dlamini-Mandela, a public speaker, a self-described serial entrepreneur, which we of course love here in Kansas City, and she's written the foreword to the prison letters. And her fashion sense, she created a fashion line of her own that was made public last year. And you'll understand where she gets her fashion sense if you look in the pictures in A Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela's autobiography. In the last section, you'll see her mother standing next to Nelson Mandela at his inauguration as president of South Africa in what I just have to tell you, you may not be able to see it, is one of the world's great hats. So ladies and gentlemen, Colleen Nelson, Sahm Venter, and Zamaswazi Dlamini-Mandela.
That was wonderful. Thanks so much to everyone for being here today. I know we have a terrific turnout. We even have an overflow crowd. So to those who are watching upstairs, hello, thank you for joining us as well. The book Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela provides fascinating insight into a man who changed the course of history. So we're so very fortunate to have the chance to hear from both of you directly today. I wanted to start with a little bit of context about your relationships and your history with Nelson Mandela. Swati, you go by Swati. When you were born, your grandfather had been in prison for nearly 17 years. And I'm interested in your early years, how that was explained to you, and just kind of how you got to know your grandfather from afar.
Thank you, Colleen. My mom and my grandmother were extremely instrumental in me from a very young age, learning about my grandfather as well as all the other political prisoners on Robben Island and why they were there and why we as grandchildren didn't have the luxury of having a grandfather that we could call and say, hey grandpa, please buy me some toys because mom won't. And just his absence and why he was not there. And they continuously ensured that we understood why he was not there. And my grandmother always used to say, he's a good man and he's carrying out something that's very important for the country. And we must always remember him. And my mom, I think for her it was a bit different, but also important for us to always know why he wasn't present. For instance, you know, I grew up in Boston for some time, and she refused for us to have a Christmas tree. You know, Christmas is such a big part of the American culture. And so all our friends would have Christmas trees, but we weren't allowed to have Christmas trees. And she said, I'm not going to put up a Christmas tree until your grandfather and all the other politicians and political prisoners are free. And my sister, who is born on June 16, which is Youth Day in our country now, but if anybody knows our history, knows what June 16 means. It was the students of Soweto protesting against being taught in Afrikaans. And many children died. So my sister also didn't celebrate her birthday for many years because my mom said, until we are free, until we are liberated, we cannot celebrate. So I grew up like that, constantly aware, constantly knowing why. And I think that I'm eternally grateful to my late grandmother and my mom because she made sure that we were educated. And we knew and understood exactly why my grandfather was not there. And my grandmother being in and out of prison all the time, and us spending a lot of time with her, we got to see it firsthand, so I lived it. I didn't, after when I grew up, I actually experienced it, so I really got to see it firsthand.
Now, Sam, I know you were a journalist for many years covering the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. You're now senior researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Could you tell us a little bit about the journey from journalist to what you're doing now and the origins of this project?
Well, it's almost kind of serendipitous, really, because Nelson Mandela was such a huge part of my work as a journalist, being in prison most of the time. And I was fortunate enough to be present when he walked out of prison. My colleague Donna Bryson is here all the way from Ohio. She was also in South Africa then. So I guess it was in 2002 that I decided to stop doing journalism because colleagues had been killed on assignment and it was just becoming way too dangerous. And somehow I got told about the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and I had a whole collection of audio tapes of my time as a journalist, including Nelson Mandela, and I donated them to the foundation, and they kept asking me to do work for them, and it stuck, and I've been there since 2006.
Now, I know you spent nearly a decade compiling these letters, many of which had not been made public before. Where had they been? How did you track them down? Could you kind of walk us through how this project came to fruition?
Sure, Colleen. In 2009, my boss asked me to go to our National Archives, which had all the prison files of all the prisoners given to them by the Department of Prisons. And Nelson Mandela himself wrote a letter giving his consent, and I was supposed to go and look through every single file and have the private letters to and from copied. I did find a selection of very compelling official letters and copied them anyway, luckily, because when he was in prison, he was not allowed to write about prison conditions to anybody but officials. So we did that, and then for a very long time, I had all of these pieces of paper on my spare bed at home until I got my act together to put them in files and figure out how to do that, and then decided to transcribe them, hundreds and hundreds of letters. And then I guess it was in late 2015, I was asked to edit a compilation into a book.
Excellent. I was struck by how deeply personal many of these letters were, and they were written to Nelson Mandela's wife, his children, his close friends, and I think from reading his own autobiography and other historical accounts, we knew a lot about Nelson Mandela, the political activist, and some about Nelson Mandela, the prisoner, but now we get to know him more as a husband and a father and a friend in this book. And one of the first letters in the book is Mandela seeking permission to send his wife a birthday telegram, and it's actually very sweet. He says, "Many happy returns, see many more, darling, tons and tons of love and a million kisses." And so, Swati, I'm interested in what you learned about your grandparents' relationship and just about your grandfather from reading these personal letters.
Well, I think I got to understand that there was a time and place when they deeply cared and loved each other. And that, first and foremost, they were husband and wife for pretty much, the entire time he was in prison. And I think I got to see their relationship and what that was like. given the fact that they couldn't physically be together, but they had an immense love for each other. You know, my grandmother found it very difficult to talk about that time. And I didn't have the pleasure of even spending a lot of time with my grandfather post his release, because then he became president, and then he formed the foundation, and then he did that. So this was such a honor to really kind of be a part of it before it came out into the public, so that I could actually, you know, grapple and come to terms and experience their relationship for myself, because that's a narrative that I feel is not, you know, in history. It kind of is, oh, they were married once upon a time and that's it. So this was such a blessing, I would say that, because I get to finally experience the fact that, you know, there was a time that my grandparents deeply, deeply cared and loved each other. And, you know, so many wonderful things came from that union, as well as so many painful things. But I love it because it puts my grandmother in history where she, I know, belongs. And for me, this book does that very well.
And I know you're wearing your grandmother on your pin today. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So in my culture, when somebody is late, we go into a period of mourning. So this symbolizes that myself and my family are in a period of mourning. And when we come to the end of our mourning period, which we have chosen 3 months, families may decide what they choose for themselves. It could be 6 months, a year, whatever they decide. We've chosen 3 months. What will happen is at the end of the mourning period, we will burn the ribbon to symbolize the end of the mourning period. But we get to keep the badge and wear that for as long as we feel.
Thank you for sharing that. Something that was so sad about reading the book was the fact that so many of the letters that Nelson Mandela wrote never reached the intended recipients. In one letter he wrote to his daughter, "I sometimes wish science could invent miracles and make my daughter get her missing birthday cards and have the pleasure of knowing that her pa loves her." And so it becomes very apparent that he knows that the odds are small that these letters will actually reach his family or whomever he's writing. And Sam, I'm interested in your thoughts about why he kept writing, knowing that there was such a small chance that the letters would get there.
Well, I think that writing was his lifeline. Besides the very few visits that he received, in the initial period he was allowed to be visited, have one visit every 6 months for 30 minutes at a time. And sometimes those visits got cancelled because the visitor had to travel by boat across the sea, the ocean, to him. And if the weather was bad, and sometimes they just got cancelled for arbitrary reasons. So I was lucky enough to be with him on Robben Island for the 4th anniversary of his release, and go into the prison cell with him. And I was aware that every single day at 3:30 in the afternoon, the guards would lock the gate, and he would be in this tiny cell, which is probably, it's much smaller than this. And they'd open up again at 5:30. And so I said to him...
The next morning.
The next morning. I said to him, what did you do for that length of time every single day? And without missing a beat, he said, I read and I wrote letters. And clearly from the subject matter of the letters, he used the letters to travel back in time to a life that he knew, to a life that he wanted, to reconnect with those people that he loved. And I think without those, prison wouldn't have been as it was for him.
I was also fascinated by the prison censors, whose job it was to count the words in the letters and decide what would be taken out and whether the letter would actually get sent. And there were all sorts of letter writing rules, and you could write about family matters, but not politics. You couldn't write about other prisoners. And in the book we read this heartbreaking story about a letter that Nelson Mandela wrote to his youngest daughter ahead of her 19th birthday. say, and she never got it. And when the letter was found years later in Mandela's prison archives, there was a note from a prison official saying that Mandela was not allowed to send a letter with a Christmas card, which apparently was the rule that he had violated in this instance. And so, Sam, I'm interested in what you can tell us about these censors, how they made these decisions as to which letter would actually go out, and what were some of the tricks that Nelson Mandela used to try and kind of work around the censors?
Well, that letter you spoke about, I found it when I did my research at the National Archive, and it was a small letter folded up in an envelope, and it was very obvious it had never been copied or sent. So I copied it and I gave it to Zinzi. It was 30 years later. It was a beautiful letter about what life was like before prison.
Okay.
So, anyway, because he was not allowed to write about prison conditions to his family, he wrote about those to the prison authorities, but there were some letters that he had, he used code, obviously. There was one in particular which was written to someone called Kwani Nimia, and all my research, all I could come up with was that it was two clan names. So Swati and I used to go and spend a lot of time with her grandmother, who had an amazing memory, and I showed her this letter and I said, "Who is this?" And she said, Dumanokwe, who was a famous lawyer at the time. And through that, I was able to track down his daughters, who could explain who people were in the letters. But what they told me was that they think he never got it, because they'd never heard of it before. And when we were at Westminster Abbey on the 18th of July, there were people there whose family had featured in the book, and I showed them the letters. And both of them said, we've never seen this before. So I think a lot more letters didn't get sent out than we thought before.
Wow. Do you think there are still letters we haven't seen at all?
And part of our long-term project is to publish the rest of the known letters. So if any of you or your friends were written to by Nelson Mandela, please let us have a copy.
Anyone that has this in the attic, let Sam know. Nelson Mandela's daughters were so young when he went to prison. The two youngest daughters were 3 and 1, and he talks about them missing him, and he says, in one letter, he says, "Zinzi says her heart is sore because I'm not at home and wants to know when I will come back. I do not know, my darlings, when I will return. You will remember that in the letter I wrote in 1966, I told you that the white judge said I should stay in jail for the rest of my life. It may be long before I come back, it may be soon. Nobody knows when it will be, not even the judge who said I should be kept here, but I am certain that one day I will be back at home to live in happiness with you until the end of my days." Swati, I'm interested in just kind of the efforts he went to be a parent from prison, and what that looked like, and how he communicated with his children.
I think the book is so interesting because I think it highlights what the apartheid system really was effective in doing, which is not only imprisoning politicians, but I think breaking down families and tearing families apart. And I think the layers in which families were impacted by the apartheid government, the violence, the brutality of it, and just, my grandfather's attempts to parent from prison and to try and be a husband from prison to not only my mom and my aunt, but my other aunts and uncles. And the letters that you read when he loses his mom and my uncle, and he makes a desperate plea to at least go and lay a stone, because by then he had actually missed the funerals of both of them. And so, it's such a window into just family dynamics and what that looked like under the apartheid government system. And, whenever my mom, when I try to kind of get her to talk about that time of her life, she finds it very difficult to go to that place. My aunt, I think, finds it a little bit cathartic and, to talk about that time. But for my mom, it's too painful for her. She can't even go there at all. She kind of says, don't ask me, you can read about it, and that's it. So, but, my grandfather was a loving parent as best as he could. He tries to ensure that they're provided for, that my grandmother is supported financially because then she can work. But at the same time, she has to look after these two small children as well as herself. But because of who she was and her activism, she really couldn't. So he writes letters to people to, support her financially, and the children, if one of them needs something or needs school fees paid, and he's continuously just, encouraging them to go to school and further their education. And he gets very excited if they excel at something, and he says, well, why don't you try studying this, and why don't you listen to this? So I think, even though they really try to take that part away from him, I think the way in which he was able to still be a father, be a husband, be a family member in a very big community, in a very big family, is very explicit in the letters, and it's expressed so well. Whether or not the letters even reached the intended recipients, is unfortunate. But at the very least, I think, the writing gave him an opportunity to be able to be a father as well as he could, because essentially that's all he had, and that's the only way he could exercise his parenthood is through the letters, and making pleas to people and asking people to support and help the family. So it was beautiful for me to see that side of him and understand that side of him and be a part of that side of him. But for my mom, and it's a very, very difficult, hurtful, painful part of her life, which she can't talk about.
And you say in the foreword, you say that the children suffered the most, and ultimately the consequences of forfeiting a stable family life for his ideals was a sacrifice that my grandfather just had to make peace with. And I know there were also times when your grandmother was incarcerated. How did the family carry on when both your grandfather and your grandmother were gone?
Yeah, I mean, the victims to me are my mom, are my aunts and my uncles. And I'm a mother now, so I can take myself to that place of, if my daughter is alone and both her dad and I are not there for her at such a young age, I mean, she essentially will feel neglected. So it makes me really understand, without my mom ever having to really express what happened, what she went through. Now that I am a mother, because I can understand the need of a parent to want to provide for their children and look after them and ensure that they have the best of everything. But both my grandparents, very often, my grandfather was in prison, but my grandmother was also in and out. And she chose that. But my parents suffered as a result. They really did. And they, I believe, had the hardest time. And they, I believe, are the real victims of the apartheid system and the apartheid government. And for me, I feel like, it's an injustice really to families, and so many broken families even today, not just my own family, so many others. At the very least, my grandmother and my grandfather were still alive at the end of apartheid, whereas lots of families don't know where their loved ones are. People went missing all the time during that time. And so they don't even have that sense of closure. Whereas at least my parents, my aunts and my uncles have, this type of, information which they can access if they ever do, but they don't need to. So apartheid was violent, it was brutal, it was there to tear families apart, and it did that very effectively and very well. And the scars, I feel, will live on for a very, very, very long time. And I think there's immense healing that still needs to take place as a result of that. But for me, I've certainly found a lot of healing, and I found it very cathartic to read this material, because it allows me to go to that place and experience that time and kind of just let some of it go.
And in the book, we see some letters that Nelson Mandela wrote to government officials pleading his case. And in 1969, he wrote a long letter to the Minister of Justice arguing that he and the other prisoners he called his colleagues should be released. And he wrote, "We are not pleading for mercy, but are exercising the inherent right of all people incarcerated for their political beliefs." Sam, can you tell us a little bit about what impact he had while he was in prison, and did these letters ever reach government officials? Did he have any reason to think that they would make a difference in terms of his fate?
I think that what we see in these letters is the trained lawyer writing as an equal to people sitting in government. He never for 1 minute thought he was inferior to anybody. He treated everybody with respect and dignity, which I believe really helped him get through it. I'm sure they received them. I'm not sure if they responded. What I find also very interesting is that in 1974, I think it was 70 and 74, he wrote again to the Minister of Justice, actually pleading the case for his wife to be allowed a firearm. Now, unlike the United States of America, it's a thing in South Africa. Firstly, you were not supposed to be black and have a firearm, but you needed a license and to go through a whole procedure. But she would be living on her own, and he quoted from letters that she had written him to say, "I woke up in the middle of the night where somebody was sitting on top of me trying to strangle me," in her own house. So he said, you know, what can I do? I'm powerless to help my wife, but I'll write to the Minister of Justice and say, please, can my wife have a firearm at least? If not, can the police patrol her property, or could she have a dog? Because she wasn't allowed to choose who could live with her. She had her brother and her brother's wife at some point, but then they were told that they couldn't live in Johannesburg anymore. They had to leave. And other people who came to live with her were intimidated by the authorities, and they thought, this is not for me. So that was another attempt of him trying to be a husband. But I think it's very clear throughout all of this is that here was a very confident person with commitment and vision who, on his very first day of prison, decided that he was not going to give up his dignity for anybody. And this is why I think, one of the reasons I think that these letters are important to all of us here, everybody in the world. Because if he can make that decision that he's not giving up his dignity for anybody, so can we. And I think it potentially empowers all of us as individuals and a world. So I mean, this is why it just so happened that this book came out when it did, when I think the world is crying out for hope. And I personally like to dip in and out of this and say, well, if he could have done this and sustained himself, then so can we.
Even though he was very limited in what he could say in the letters, we did get a little bit of a sense of the prison conditions that he lived in, the lime quarry where he had to do hard labor, the fact that there were no beds for the first 10 years that he was in prison. Sam, you said that this was one of the most unexpected discoveries that you came across from reading these letters. What can you tell us about just kind of what his day-to-day existence was like in prison?
Well, you know, in the beginning, you know, there were no white prisoners allowed on Robben Island, where he spent 18 years, only black, which includes everybody who's not white. There was one of his accused, Dennis Goldberg, who was white, and he had to be sent to Pretoria by himself. So for the first 13 years, it was hard labor, which ranged from smashing stones to digging in the lime quarry. And, you know, when they had important visitors once in a while, they all of a sudden got a raincoat. So when that visitor came and it was raining, it looked like, you know, they were being taken care of, but the raincoat was taken away. And they came back in the first few weeks with bleeding hands and blisters. And these were lawyers, medical doctors, academics, PhDs, intellectuals, essentially. And then they were also not allowed pajamas. And those of you who've been to Robben Island will know it's freezing cold in winter, besides anything else. So, and Nelson Mandela essentially and his other African colleagues, the ethos of apartheid was to treat African people as if they were children. And he was, in the first few years, he was not allowed long trousers because he was regarded as a boy. And that was a battle, and some of his colleagues who were not Africans would insist on protesting, and he said, no, don't protest because you might lose what you already have. So it took years, and then eventually he was allowed to wear long trousers also, but it was a battle every single day.
Well, to your earlier point about his making the decision that he was not going to give up his dignity, I mean, reading this book, it's just astonishing to just kind of understand both his patience and his unwavering optimism over 27 years. And I mean, whether he really believed it or not, he kept saying that eventually change would come, the right thing would happen, eventually he would be a free man. And I'm interested in each of your perspectives of just kind of what you saw in him that helped him maintain this optimism, and whether he really thought those things would happen, or whether this is just kind of what you have to tell yourself to get to the next day.
Well, I mean, for me, I think that what struck me the most about this was that I think he was a consistent person going in, and I think coming out of prison. I think that people have this misconception that prison changed him. I don't believe that. And I think it's very clear and evident in the letters that he decided when he went in that he would be dignified and respectful and respect others. So for me, I believe there has to be a sense of he probably had to tell himself that also to make it through it. There probably were some times when he didn't feel like there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that, you know, he would eventually experience freedom. But I think that in order for him to make it through it, he had to. And he did that, and it's just so clear and so evident that he really was that person every single day. I don't want to take this moment from Sam, but one of his prison inmates, Ahmad Katwada, said that he only ever saw my grandfather lose his temper twice. You know, and the one time had to do with my grandmother. And so I think that says a lot about who he was. And I think it's actually just fundamentally to the core of his being, who he was. Over time, he matured, absolutely, as we all do. But I think even for the better, really. He continuously kept on improving himself, educating himself, wanting to be a better person, wanting to expand his knowledge. And that's who he was to the core of his being. So I don't think he was changed by prison. I think that other people were changed by him in prison and outside of prison.
So maybe some of you are aware of this, but in apartheid South Africa, you had what we called common law prisoners, people who committed robbery, assault, rape, murder. They got parole, and they knew they were going to get parole. But political prisoners did not. And if you were sentenced to life, like Madiba and his colleagues, you knew that life meant life. So they went into prison thinking that the state wanted them to die there. The state also wanted them to be forgotten. But in conversations with Ahmed Kathrada and others, it became apparent that they never ever lost hope. And hope sustained them. And where you have hope, you have positive action. And as I think you said, or your director, about Madiba quoting the power of positive thinking, just be positive, stay positive, and do everything in a positive frame of mind, and live in hope. And that's what sustained them, and it worked out, luckily.
Not every letter in the book is focused on fighting for justice or protesting prison conditions, and I was kind of tickled to read some of the quirky things that popped up in his letters as well. We see Nelson Mandela requesting Pond's cold cream for his dry skin, and they had given him Vaseline and that wasn't working out. And as you and Crosby noted, he did encourage his wife to read The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. And there's also a letter that comes very late in the book where he wrote to Mike Tyson, the boxing champ, and writes a letter. He starts out and he says, "Dear Champ," and he congratulates Mike Tyson on receiving an honorary doctorate degree and thanks him for a pair of boxing gloves. And so I'm curious if there were other quirky things that you learned about Nelson Mandela from reading his letters.
Well, there's so many. I mean, you talk about the Pond's cold cream, and Swati and I were both wondering when Pond's is going to like cotton onto this. He also suffered from what do you call high blood pressure from the beginning when he went into prison in 1962, and he researched it a lot. And one of the excerpts he found in his reading was that honey was really good, and so was evening primrose oil. And he tried to get that, and the authorities were having none of it. They said, no, this is nonsense. He gets the best medical care. He's not getting honey. He's not getting this evening primrose oil, whatever it is. But I think we all have to remember that his prison guards were ill-educated. In South Africa at the time, white men were supposed to either go into the army or into the police or into the prison service as a form of national service. So the ones who went into the prison service were kind of like, I don't want to say it, but, you know, not top of the heap. And, you know, he would often complain about, they would sit in on his visits. He wasn't allowed to talk his own language. They didn't understand, most of them, his own language. They barely understood English. And in one of the letters, you see how he complained about the censors, who was a warder or two, censoring his letters. He wrote about the war of ideas in a letter, and they objected to that, saying you're not allowed to write about war. So, ultimately, he won most of them over, thankfully.
Well, so the book takes us on this 27-year journey building up to his eventual release from prison after more than 10,000 days. Can each of you tell us how you experienced his release and what that was like for you to finally see him walk free?
Well, for me, we were living in Boston at the time, and my mom received a call to say that my grandfather was due to be released. And I don't know when in the course of that time my mom sat us down, but she sat myself and my siblings down to say, apparently your grandfather's supposed to be released and it's quite imminent, and Big Mommy, my grandmother, my late grandmother, is asking us to come home. And my mom said, I've taken the decision that I'm not going to go home, and we're not going to go home because we've been through this before, and I'm not going to put myself and I'm not going to put you guys through this. And so I said, okay, well, I mean, you know, you're the parent, I guess it is what it is. And so we, for the next couple of days, we kind of, you know, sat around, but we increasingly noticed and saw a lot of activity outside our home, and we saw reporters sort of lingering around. And I think at the time, I thought, oh, well, okay, whatever. But what eventually happened was, you know, we sat, you know, in a couch in Boston, Massachusetts, watching my grandfather and my grandmother walk out of prison gates, and that was my experience of it, because my mom just found it too difficult, and she essentially just didn't even believe it was actually going to happen. And only a few weeks thereafter, my grandmother called and said, okay, you have to come home. It's important that you are also here as a family and you also get to experience this. And I guess for my mom, you've got to see your father, you know, for the first time outside of prison bars. So we got on the plane with Oprah and Stedman. We'll just drop that in there.
I love this part of the story.
And we flew home with quite a big delegation of people. And I distinctly remember driving up what is called Vilagazi Street back home, where my grandmother's home, my grandparents' home was at the time. And they were just hundreds and hundreds of people just lined up the street. You could barely even get a car up the street. And when we eventually could get into a house, and it was a tiny house, it was like a 4-roomed house, very, very small. When we could eventually make it through the house into through the yard into the house, my grandfather was wearing a suit, as he did so often in those days. And, you know, we embraced, but my mom was extremely emotional. And go ahead.
Go ahead, Seth.
So I was a reporter for the Associated Press, and I was assigned to go to the prison. We were told the day before that tomorrow he's walking out of prison, so we were all very excited. And initially they said, you're not allowed to go to the prison. So I went to go and find a farmer to pretend, you know, to go there and wait. And I was stopped at a roadblock, staffed by an activist who knew me and a policeman who yesterday was the enemy. And the activist goes, she's a journalist. And I'm like, no, I'm not. So got to the prison eventually, and there were like hundreds of people, and he was late, and CBS had hired a cherry picker, and they were up in the little thingy, whatever it's called, and they let me stand in the base, and they said, look, as soon as he comes out, jump, because we're going to come down fast. So I was waiting there, we were waiting there, and sorry. It always gets me, but anyway. It was a very hot day, and then you saw suddenly this tall person with like a halo, and his fist in the air. That was
Swati, you write in the book that the book is a reminder that we could go back to a place of hatred, like what we saw in South Africa. Do you think that's a real possibility at this moment? And what do you think your grandfather would say about the political climate right now, both in South Africa and the United States?
I don't speak for my grandparents. I don't think I could do them justice if I ever tried to answer on their behalf. I think this book provides us an insight into how, you know, humanity and human rights and freedom of expression and freedom of self and dignity of fellow human beings is just what they fought for and what they believed in. And I think it applies today in so many different ways. You know, I think one of the most poignant quotes of his is that, you know, when he says he had to forgive when he left prison, because if he didn't, then he would still be in prison even though he physically wasn't there. So for me, I think forgiveness is the thing I take from him that I learned the most. Because I think it's what enabled him to walk out and sit with his oppressors, to forge a new way forward and to deliver democracy to the country. And he always said that it is important that we forgive, but that we don't forget. Because if we forget, then it would be very easy for us to repeat the same behavior all over again and for us to go back to that place. So I think that it's critical that we are mindful of where we were. And, you know, our democracy is 20 plus years. It's a very young democracy. And we're trying to deal with 200 plus years of, you know, oppression. So that I believe is going to take time. I do. You know, he delivered political freedom, but he said there's still social and economic that needs to be delivered by you. I hand it over to you as South Africans to take the country forward. So I always say that I think it's the responsibility of all of us to continue what they did, and they left us with such a rich legacy that I think it would be irresponsible if we weren't mindful of the sacrifices that both my grandmother and my grandfather made. And for me, it's vital that I always speak about my grandmother, because hers is a voice and a name that has been, I think, purposely eradicated from history. I think it's very flippant what her contribution was. But for me, I saw my grandmother in and out of jail. I saw her pulled out of her house in the middle of the night. You know, I saw her ripped apart from her children, and I saw her trying to spend her entire life trying to make that up. And I saw her live with the fact that my grandfather was put up here and she was put down here, and the pain that caused her, because, you know, essentially.
So this past Wednesday was the 100th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's death, and former President Barack Obama delivered the Nelson Mandela lecture Wednesday in South Africa, and I was fortunate enough to travel with Obama and his family when they went to South Africa, and at the time Nelson Mandela was hospitalized, and Obama decided that it would cause too much commotion and too many problems to go visit in the hospital, but he met with members of Mandela's family on that trip, and then President Obama and his family visited the jail cell on Robben Island, and it was such a profound moment to see how that affected President Obama, and I know what an impact that trip had on President Obama and just how he viewed his relationship with President Mandela. Sam, I'm curious what your impression was of how President Mandela viewed Obama and just what that relationship was like.
Well, you know, they only met once, and that was before President Obama became president in Chicago. Nelson Mandela was visiting, and President Obama popped in as a courtesy to say hi, and there's one photograph. It's really beautiful. It was taken with a cell phone. He's sitting there. You can see who President Mandela was, but there's this very distinctive silhouette of President Obama. And he was really proud when he became president of America. Really, really proud. And, you know, I think we don't need to talk for anybody, but if you read these letters and you read what made Nelson Mandela tick, why he gave up what he gave up, the answer is really simple, that human beings are supposed to love each other. Hatred is very, very, very I think he said it in Long Walk to Freedom, that love is natural. It comes naturally to the human heart. You have to be taught to hate. And I think if this book has any message, it's a warning against going down that path. We cannot hate.
We do want to take some questions from the audience, so we have a roving microphone, and if you want to just put up your hand.
Make your way either over to me on this side or to my colleague over here, whichever is closest to you, so the audience can hear your question as well as the speakers.
Well, while people are walking, I know a lot of folks actually traveled from long distances to be here today. If you're from out of town, maybe put up your hand. I'm interested. I know we have folks from Denver and Ohio and Philly. If you're from out of town, could you put up your hand? Thank you.
And I'd just like to say that my friend Chris Mazivananga and his family drove from Ohio to be here, so thank you.
Bravo.
Colleen did a great job, and I know somebody out there has a question.
I wanted to say that my colleague, Danny Alexander, brought Eddie Daniels to our campus at Johnson County Community College, and he said to send you his love. And the reason I'm telling the Eddie Daniels story is because he was incarcerated with Nelson Mandela at Robben Island. And he told us the story to show us how important and how true Mandela was to himself. Daniels was sick. He was very sick, could not control his body, any of his body fluids, and Nelson Mandela came to his cell, brought him water, and cleaned his slop jar. Mm-hmm. And he said he was humble enough to clean his slop jar. I think he had an amazing legacy.
Sorry, they can't hear you this side. They can't hear you.
You missed my story. Okay. I was telling about Eddie Daniels, who was incarcerated with Nelson Mandela at Robben Island. And he told us that Mandela was an incredible man, not just politically and but personally. And he always thought about other people. And Daniels was sick. He was very sick. He was feverish. He could not control his body fluids. And Mandela came into his prison cell and brought him water. And then Eddie Daniels said, and he cleaned my slop jar. And he sent his love to the family. What an incredible legacy you have.
Thank you.
Colleen, right to your left. Right here. Thank you. So you were involved with this project. I'd kind of like to learn how your siblings have responded to these letters. Did they learn anything? Have your experience been similar to theirs, or basically fill us in?
I think, is this still on? Okay. I think of my family members, because I'm involved in the work, I actually read some of it. I wasn't even able to read all of it because it was actually too difficult for me to read all of it. But I don't think my siblings can engage with it. Maybe over time they will be able to. I think a lot of them kind of feel like they know the story and they don't feel that they kind of have to go into depth with it because it's too hard. But, my mom has never read any of it and she refuses to read any of it. And although I know that she's very proud and she thinks that it's important for this to be published and for the information to be out there, I think for my family it's too difficult. I mean, I can barely sit through an interview without shedding a tear or two every single time because it's still so raw. So I think I'll carry the weight for them. But they're all very strong people, trust me. They probably wouldn't like me saying that because they are very tough, strong people. But, it's been painful for them. Extremely, extremely painful for them. But I think we're all just trying to move forward in our lives. And I'm proud of each and every single one of us because I think we are mindful of the fact that there's this, legacy that has been left to us, and I think we're trying to be very responsible with what we do and how we carry it forward. By no means are we perfect, and my grandfather always said that he wasn't perfect either. But I think with us just ensuring that we live our own lives in our own way, but however we take our grandparents' legacy forward. Thank you for that question.
Yes, I do want to say this. I want to commend you for coming. I want to commend her for coming, Nelson Mandela's daughter. Niece. I'm sorry about that.
Still can't hear. Sorry, I still can't hear.
Granddaughter, I'm sorry about that. I do want to say this. Some of us sit here and we point the finger at Donald Trump and say, you always talking about racism and all this. Nelson Mandela preached against hatred. We sometimes point the finger at Donald Trump and say how much hatred he got and how much we love, and love starts within our heart. Until we begin to grapple with what's in our heart, because anybody could put on an outside expression and say how much they care about somebody, but love starts within. We as society, we're not animals, we're human beings. What happened over in South Africa, what happened in the 60s in the United States and beyond, was basically hatred from within. We have to deal with this, and some of us sit here and we blame others for what's going on. Donald Trump is basically a product of American society, of American racism that was breeded. So we can't blame him for what's going on. We have to look at ourselves and try to make a better world for our children. But the question is, what I'm saying is that, I know we don't want to hear this, but we could talk about this and
So let me see if I can turn that into something of a question for you. Can you speak just a little bit as to how Nelson Mandela felt about the people that did this to him, the people that projected this hatred on him? How did he meet that hatred with love and respect?
Well, as Swati said earlier, when he walked out of prison, he decided that, of course he was angry with what had happened to him, but that if he didn't leave that anger behind, they would still control him. And I think that hatred was their problem. It wasn't his. The forgiveness was to make himself free, not to free them. Okay. I'm not sure what he was saying.
Dr. Peter Osei Kwame. I grew up in Ghana. I was a young man 20 years ago, 20 years old, when Nelson was in prison. His struggle in South Africa became the struggle for the young men in Ghana. I have forgotten, I want you to repeat for the audience, what reason was given for his release when they have pronounced him life imprisonment without parole? What reason was given for his release? Was it economic pressure? Was it an angel from heaven who came to declare, President declared? Was it Satan himself who came? What reason was assigned by de Klerk?
I don't remember de Klerk actually giving a reason, to be honest. But it was a combination of international pressure and pressure from within South Africa. There were protests all over the place. There was the United Democratic Front, which was an umbrella body of more than 400 anti-apartheid organizations. Mandela himself had reached out to certain members of the cabinet from 1986 to talk to them about what would be needed for them to sit down together and plot a way forward for the country. And amongst those were that the state had to give up violence, that they had to lift the state of emergency, they had to unban political organizations, release prisoners. They were cornered. They could do no other. The country was imploding. The world was, even their allies in the West, the United States, Britain and others, were turning against them. The people in those countries were rising up against them. And they had reached a point where they had to release him from prison. I remember being a journalist and going to, on the 2nd of February 1990, de Klerk, who had taken over from P.W. Botha, the hard man of politics who had had a stroke. He was a pragmatist. I don't think he had a Damascene moment at all. I think he realized that he had to do this. And so he did it. And Nelson Mandela came out of prison, and everybody had to take a leap of faith that this was going to work. At the same time, the ANC knew they had armed people within the country in case it didn't work. There was a lot of mistrust, but I don't remember him giving an actual specific reason.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Yes. Did he get any support from Amnesty International?
Did he get support from Amnesty International?
Yes.
Well, the first letter in this book, he writes to Amnesty, as it was called then, in November 1962, to thank them for sending an observer to his trial. The very next day, he was convicted for leaving the country without a passport and inciting workers to strike and sentenced to 5 years in prison. So from the beginning, Amnesty did help him. Yes.
For Mr. Mandela's granddaughter, you were in Boston, you went and visited him afterwards, but what was your relationship with him after he was released until the end of his life? Were you always in the United States, in Boston? Did you go back? Were you able to develop a relationship with your grandfather?
So we went back home, and I think my grandmother called and demanded us to come back home, as she demanded many things from us all the time. And my parents listened. So we went back, I believe it was 92. And what actually happened was my mom took myself and my siblings back first. And she dumped us with my grandmother, and she's like, okay, you wanted us back, take the kids first and we'll follow. So my parents came back to Boston and stayed, I think, for another year before they actually moved back. No, I can't really say that I had the relationship that I would have liked to have had with my grandfather, because he was thrust into his presidency soon thereafter. And then soon after his presidency ended, then he started the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And that took him all across the world and everywhere. I used to have to make an appointment to go and see my grandfather if I wanted to. So I'd have to call his PA and say, I'd like to come and see him. She'd pencil me in, and I would visit him for the little bit of time that I could. If I just so happened to decide I'm driving past the house and I dropped in and he just so happened to be there, it would be very common. I would walk in and he's sitting with the head of state, or he's sitting with there was always people around. So I didn't get the opportunity to have the kind of relationship that I would have liked to have had. And then once he retired, he was so much older then. So essentially what we would do is just ensure that we spent time with him as a family. We were just always around each other, and we were always just there. Even if he would just sit and read the newspaper, which he read the whole day, of course, and he read every newspaper you could think of. And I just eventually over time was like, I will take what I can get, and I will take whatever God has given me. But it always saddened me that my mom and my aunts and my uncles weren't able to, now finally their dad is released, to have the relationship that they would have liked to have had all these years. And then my grandparents' divorce, that also tore my family apart, because we were so close to my grandmother. My grandmother was Big Mommy to us, and she raised us. And so that obviously created quite a separation from my grandfather, because then my grandparents got divorced. And I, for a long time, didn't understand how he could leave my grandmother. That was very hard for me to also come to terms with, because having seen what she had experienced and what she had done, I felt he abandoned her and gave up on her, and that was very hard for me to grapple with. But at some point, I had to come to a peace, because I said, if I let this continue, then it puts it in the way of me having a relationship with my own grandfather, even a little bit that I could have. So I had to get to a point of forgiveness myself for him, for what I saw was abandonment towards my grandmother, whom had essentially raised us and done so much for us. But I think by the end of it, I am grateful for whatever time I was afforded with him and whatever I was able to have with him. And for my daughter who's 9, you know, she often says, Mom, did I know Granddad, Big Grandpa? Did I ever spend time with him? And I'll show her pictures of them spending time together because she was so little at the time. And them holding hands, you know, she would often like sit with him for a few minutes, and she loved to hold his hand. And you know, my grandfather beamed when kids walked into the room. He loved children, and he loved his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, my apologies. So I'm grateful that she can look at pictures and she can see herself with her great-grandfather. I had whatever experiences and time that I did have with him, no matter when it was in his life and in my life. I'm grateful for that. And I came to a peace about everything. I had to. Because like him, it would have imprisoned me for my life.
One more here to the left.
Question, I guess, for either of you. I was in South Africa in 2010, and I spent a lot of time just talking to a lot of people about what was it like when Nelson Mandela came back. What was it like? And the primary response that I got from people was he called them to forgiveness. He spoke about it, and the people that I spoke to said there was just a deep reverence for that call, and they responded. So my question is, how important do you think this work is for this nation at this time?
Well, as I said before, I think his work is important for the world. And what he always used to say, in his opinion, a leader needs to have a vision, and then he needs to persuade the people to follow that vision. People are not going to follow a vision that they don't feel is going to be right. He chose forgiveness and reconciliation. As Swati said earlier, he never said you've got to forget. You must always remember so that you don't do the same thing again, but that you must forgive so that you can move on. He had a vision, and he led to that vision. So wherever in the world we see strife, we have to know that the leader needs to step up and not tell people what to do, but to draw them into that vision, and then they can go forward.
Last question?
Steve, you want to get this question in the back, and then we'll end right here, I think, with this next one.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Adele Morgan. In the 1990s, I experienced apartheid standards of health care. And while I was living on the West Coast, I came back to the Midwest, and the standards that were told to me were incorrect. And I knew that before I moved back here. My concern is, what are the qualities and standards for health care now in South Africa? What are the qualities of health care in South Africa? I was told that because I was dark-skinned when I lived in the state of Washington, that my blood sugar would be 250 to 300. And so I immediately went and found a supervisor and filed a complaint. But I want to know, what are the standards now for health care in South Africa? Is there a big change now?
The standards of healthcare in South Africa.
Based on skin color.
Oh, no. Okay. No. I think we come from an imperfect past, and I think we have inherited a lot of apartheid's systematic separation of black, colored, Indian, or let me say non-white and white. And our infrastructure was built based upon that. And so I believe we, going forward, have to address a lot of those ills that were implemented by an apartheid government and apartheid system. I certainly don't think that things are perfect at the moment, but I believe that we are working towards a country and a democracy in which all people can be treated fairly, which is what both my grandparents fought for.
Two quick notes before we do our last question here. I want to remind everybody that the book is available for sale just on the other side of these bookshelves here. And both ladies will be signing copies when we're done. And on a personal note, I just wanted to say thank you both. I know you're only in the States for a short time, and we are tremendously honored that you chose our library and our city to be among the places you work. Did have one question left though, because I've been saving what I think is going to be the best one for last.
Nkosi Kakulu, thank you very much for being here. I just really want to share something. It's more sharing than a question. My uncle was a prison guard at Robben Island when Madiba was there. Wow. And he unfortunately lost the battle against cancer in the late 1990s. But on the day of his funeral, my aunt received a telegraph from Madiba's office sending his condolences and just sending out to Uncle George that he was thinking about his family throughout. And I think that speaks to his forgivingness, the relationship he built with the prison guards at Paulsmoor and at Robben Island. So I thought I just wanted to share that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for a fantastic discussion today. I'm sure that for anyone in the audience who hasn't had the chance yet to read the prison letters of Nelson Mandela, it will jump up to the top of their must-read list now. But I really appreciate you giving us a window into who Nelson Mandela was and taking us on an emotional journey with you. And thanks to everyone who joined us. Thanks to the Kansas City Public Library. And this was a fantastic way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Thank you.